Hello and welcome to this lecture on stagflation. In this class, we consider the period in the 1970s that was marked by low growth, high inflation and high unemployment. This case study will help us to better understand the trade-offs and limits of monetary policy. The term stagflation is a combination of stagnation and inflation. Stagflation is particularly challenging for central banks. To stimulate the economy, central banks lower interest rates. However, low interest rates also tend to increase inflation. In a situation where growth is low and inflation is high, central banks have limited options. The graph shows you consumer price inflation from 1960 to 1990. You can see that during the late 1960s, inflation started to accelerate. The largest spikes are in 1974 and 1980, when the inflation rate hit 11 and 13.5% respectively. Let's look at the reasons for these spikes. The main reason are two large oil shocks. The first oil shock was triggered by an oil embargo of OPEC against the United States and other, mostly Western countries in the wake of the Yom Kippur War. Within a few months, the price of oil rose nearly 300%, from $3 per barrel to about $11. This was an enormous cost shock to the economy. Since almost all parts of the economy used oil as an input, for instance in form of gasoline or for power generation or in the chemical industry, producer prices increased drastically. At the same time, consumers had to pay more for gas and heating, reducing their spending on other consumption goods. Just a couple of years later, the second oil shock hit the economy. In the wake of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War in 1980, oil production declined. As a result of declining oil supply and uncertainty about future oil supply, oil prices skyrocketed. In 1980, the price of oil reached $39.50 per barrel, a more than tenfold increase since early 1973. In the US, the car manufacturers were particularly hard hit as they struggled to offer more fuel-efficient cars. These large shocks led to a slowdown of the economy. In the graph, you see the unemployment rate. It reached a post-World War II high of 9% in 1975 and decreased again with the second oil shock in 1981, reaching 7.8%. Recall that the Federal Reserve's mandate is stable prices and maximum employment, but the oil shocks produced the opposite effects: high inflation and high unemployment. The oil shocks are examples of supply shocks. The graph illustrates how supply shocks shift out the trade-off between unemployment and inflation, which is also called the Phillips curve. We discussed the Phillips curve in detail in a separate lecture. When facing supply shocks, the options of monetary policy are limited, as lower interest rates do not affect supply constraints. Indeed, many responses to the oil shocks were not monetary, but affected oil demand in the short and in the long run. The most drastic short-term response to the 1973 oil shock was rationing gas in the United States. For instance, vehicles with license plates having an odd number could buy gas only on odd-numbered days, while others could buy only on even-numbered days. Responses with considerable long-term impact on oil demand eventually helped to reduce oil prices. Here are a couple of examples. To reduce gas consumption, a national maximum speed limit of 55 miles per hour was imposed in 1974. A year later, in 1975, the corporate average fuel economy standards were created. These standards required better fuel economy for cars and light trucks in the US. At the same time, the US developed the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. These measures and increases in production eventually led to the so-called oil glut in the 1980s. Oil prices dropped considerably and contributed to bringing down inflation. These supply shocks in the 1980s helped shifting back the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. As you can see in the graph, in the second half of the 1980s, considerably less inflation was needed to reduce unemployment when compared to the early 1980s. Even though monetary policy can do little to counteract supply shocks, this period caused a change in inflation expectations. That is, the consensus shifted from a low inflation regime to a regime in which inflation would remain high. High inflation expectations led to high wage demands, which in turn increased inflation. When Paul Volcker became the chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979, he wanted to bring down inflation and inflation expectations. He did so by raising the federal funds rate, which reached 19% in December 1981. The sharp increases in interest rates, together with increasing oil prices, triggered the 1980 and 1982 recessions. Unemployment rose to over 10%, the highest level between the end of World War II and the COVID-19 pandemic. In other words, in this period, the Federal Reserve chose to focus on inflation rather than unemployment, despite the dual mandate of stable prices and maximum employment. Raising the federal funds rate led to a large drop in inflation. More importantly, the Federal Reserve accepted the price of temporary higher unemployment to bring down inflation. This was seen as a credible commitment to low inflation in the future. This commitment in turn brought down inflation expectations, which helped to establish a low inflation regime. What have we learned in this lesson? First, supply shocks, such as oil price shocks, can shift the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Second, monetary policy is not an effective tool to counteract supply shocks. Third, if supply shocks move inflation expectations permanently, central banks may have to accept high unemployment temporarily to bring down inflation and inflation expectations.